Welcome to the Hat of Many Things with me, Michael, and my co-host,
Tom.
And joining us today is Rob. Rob, how are you doing, friend?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I missed a word in that sentence. It was how are you doing? I'm glad you're doing well. I'm doing okay. I'm on the job hunt right now, so I'm a little unprepared for this episode, thanks. But fortunately, Rob, I am assured by Tom, knows an awful lot about the subject. And today's subject is Brexit. So, Rob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do?
I work for a publishing company. We do secondary school publications, and also kind of my semi-qualifications for this, I guess, is I studied history and politics at university, and I'm also editor for politics section, and we run a politics magazine, which I also edit. So
fantastic. So my children's novel, Maybot 3000, should go through you then when I seek publication.
Oh, certainly. Yes, please.
Yeah. So it's about a sad little robot who had to keep replacing parts so she'd fit in and eventually fell to pieces.
Oh, no.
While claiming they were strong and stable.
Indeed. So, Brexit. What is a Brexit? I believe it is a shorthand, really quite patronising and insulting term for the British exit of the European Union. Tom, thoughts on that statement?
I mean, in the chat room I heard Brexit means Brexit, which indeed it does. That's as helpful as the first rule of Fight Club being the first rule of Fight Club.
Yeah. We have an audience, a live studio audience for the first time. Say hello to Wade, everybody. Hi, Wade.
Hello, Wade. Hi, Wade. We're in your ears. This isn't creepy at all.
Slowly massaging your brain.
While you kill all those, whatever it is you're killing in Age of Empires.
It's being very British. It's a game about empires.
And maybe that's something we'll get back, except we won't. Brexit means Brexit. Yeah, I mean, it is a shortening of the words. Well, it's not even a good portmanteau. That's the most annoying thing, right? Because it should be like... So normally a portmanteau is when you take half of a word and another half of a word, roughly, and stick them together. Brexit stands for British exit from the European Union, but they obviously cut that bit off because it would sound bad. And they kept the whole word exit in there, so I'm already annoyed at it.
Should be something like Brexit to you.
Yeah, it would sound a bit French, though, and I think that probably wouldn't go with what they were going for.
It's not much of a sound bite, is it? It sounds like something you put garlic in.
I mean, yeah.
What qualifies us to talk about Brexit, Tom?
Well, we are
obviously
British.
Bob has credentials, but...
I'm going with the fact that I'm British and I voted in the election, referendum, I mean, and therefore I feel I can give my opinion about it. Also, like a lot of people my age, I'm a bit annoyed about it. So
I'm going with I'm halfway through my second glass of gin, and this entitles me to a rant. So, what is Brexit? What is the European Union, for a start? We're leaving it. What are we leaving? Rob.
Oh, gosh, okay, start off with a nice easy one to begin with. The European Union is a conglomerate of around, I think, 28 countries, maybe soon to be 27 once we leave, that governs... It's a supranational, so it goes above our levels of national government and controls things above it. Primarily trade, but also there's elements of justice as well. So if you've heard of the European Court of Human Rights, it makes sure that there is a universal code of justice across the whole of the European Union. And finally, there's a bit of security and defence in there for good measure as well. So even though we've got NATO and many members of the European Union are also members of NATO, they do some control of the defence of Europe as well. So, yeah.
So is it not a superstate? If it's what idea was it?
Yeah.
Supranational.
Supernatural. It's a supernatural entity governing our lives. So if it's a supranational organisation and it can overrule our government on certain issues, is it not in fact our government?
No, I mean that was one argument that was put by sort of the Leave campaign, and I'm sure we'll address that later. It governs only certain parts of our rules and what we do. I think if you're comparing it so the obvious comparison would be with the United States. So the United States is 50 federal states, which all have their own rules and legislations, and they are governed by at the federal level by the rules of the president. And that's all very, sort of set out. That's got a very hard structure, and they all have, different levels of rules that they follow. With the EU, each nation state comes with its, sorry, it's a bit clearer. Each nation state has a very defined set of rules that existed even before the EU existed. So a lot of their laws take precedent before the EU laws. EU laws only sort of come into account from 1980s onwards. Really.
So what happens when an EU law contradicts a UK law?
The British government the British government first of all puts in their own laws and tries to make sure that nobody in the UK tries to challenge that at the European level. So a good example of this would be voting rights for prisoners. So in the UK, we don't allow prisoners to vote, but that is actually in contravention of the European Court of Human Rights legislation. But what happened is the government just sort of flatly ignored that and went to fight it at European Court level. What happened with that eventually was that the European Court rejected our appeal, but the government refused to even enact any laws that would allow prisoners to vote, kind of daring the EU almost to say, well, come and stop us.
Okay, so with the total UK prison population being roughly 86,000 people, theoretically, a political party, should the prison population be allowed to vote, could gain 86,000 votes just by saying, oh, we're going to reduce everyone's sentence by 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you can see the argument for and against that from a human rights perspective, and from a purely why would we allow this perspective. There are differing arguments, and honestly, we should get into conversation with that on our discussions in the justice system when we do draw them out of the hat. Speaking of which, what hat are you wearing today, Tom?
I am wearing an umbrella for a head.
An umbrella for a head? Where on earth would you get such a silly thing?
I think it may have been a gift from a certain Mike's hat.
I see.
It took a little longer to arrive than the other gift you got me because it came from China, I believe, judging by the stamp on it. But it is brilliantly silly and the kind of thing that looks stupidly British, despite the fact it was made in China. In some ways, a metaphor for Brexit.
Is Brexit made in China or is it made in Russia?
Ooh. Well.
So, how does the European Union differ from the European centralised market? Obviously they're interlinked, but to what degree?
They don't really differ because the fact is that they all came under a central control in 2008 under the Lisbon Treaty. They're all under sort of like the same umbrella of control. Is that what you're asking, or is there?
Honest to God, I don't know the answer to the question. So the question is very open.
Yeah. No. Well, I think we've hit on a core point which might come around in our Brexit discussions, is that essentially the EU is really hard to understand. Okay, and it's really hard for. I think it's fair to say we're all fairly educated people. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean.
Yeah.
Bachelor's degree here, PhD over in Tom's corner.
Exactly.
So he's the intellectual heavyweight of the hosts.
But it wasn't politics; it was physics. So not necessarily helpful.
But even as somebody who studied politics for 3 years, as you can probably tell a little, it's the European Union is still an incredibly difficult, intermingled, bureaucratic organisation that's very hard for the average person to understand. Never mind people educated to university level.
Okay, so we elect MPs.
Yes.
By virtue of essentially a glorified popularity contest. These MPs are often either educated in one place or not particularly educated. There's a massive mixed bag there. Why would we think that these people might understand this when somebody studying politics at university doesn't? Yes, they may have been working in this environment for an amount of time, but they're not educated to any particularly high level on the subject. What gives them the influence, knowledge, and power to make these decisions?
In short, not much. They will probably look to their own constituents and what they think, and what the constituents think on the issue of the European Union, and be guided by that to a degree. I think we've seen that since the Brexit vote, that a lot of MPs who supported the European Union, I think the Parliament itself before Brexit was overwhelmingly pro-European, now go back to listening to the views of their constituents in very Brexit-heavy areas, now saying, no, I must listen to them, and that's going to influence my decision-making on this issue.
Tom, how long has the UK been a part of this European Union? Because we've been fighting wars with them for thousands of years.
So, I mean, again, I don't have a degree in history and politics, but if we roll back the clock a bit before the timeline we have in our show notes, well, sorry, not show notes, in our notes, we've been at war often with France because they were closest, and also because they had an empire. We had an empire, a lot of fighting.
I believe one famous Brit calls them cheese-eating surrender monkeys, despite the fact that they have a more successful military history than the British Isles.
But less navy, I think. But yes, generally, we did quite well by having a lot of boats, allowing us to undo a lot of our bad decisions later by being like, "Hey, we've got a navy, and we're now saying slavery is banned." But yes, if you roll it back after World War II, there was a lot of talk about how can we stop this happening again, which had already happened after World War One, but World War One was basically set up for World War Two. So people talked about this after World War One, didn't get it right. After World War Two, they're like, okay, we need to change what we're doing, and so there was and it wasn't just at the European level, also at the national level, because we have things like NATO that came up at the same kind of time. Basically, all the countries were saying, how do we stop this happening? There was some weird stuff going on with Germany being two countries for a long time. Germany, as we see it now, has not been a country for my entire lifetime. Only just. I was just born in '89.
You're old. I'm younger than unified Germany.
But yeah, like the World War, obviously, both World Wars had a terrifying effect on the population, and obviously afterwards people wanted to try and stop something terrible like that ever happening again, which led to a build-up of these kind of treaties and stuff that have slowly turned into the EU. I mean, if we look at the timeline we've got, UK joined the EEC in 1975 by a vote of about a two-third majority, and then we've slowly that transformed into the EU. But 1975 it probably wasn't really the EU for at least 11 years because the Parliament comes in 1986. So there's a lot happening there that I'm probably not the most qualified to unpick.
Here's a question for Rob. Rob, Russia, nominally a European country, even if the majority of its land mass is not. Why is Russia not a member of the EU?
Because the EU was set up almost primarily, I think Tom touched on it at the start, that after the Second World War, you've got a build-up of countries within Western Europe looking to combine in some way to strengthen because of the threat from the East. So you've got that historical precedent there.
That's Eastern Europe as opposed to Eastern
yes.
world, yeah.
Eastern Europe and Russia, which was seen as the threat at the time.
Okay.
So that sort of remained the way until 1991, when you've got the breakup of the Soviet Union, and then post-Cold War, the countries that had just come out of the Soviet bloc, instead of looking to Russia, which they'd seen as their oppressors for many years, they were the ones that they'd just thrown the shackles off, and they were also economically weak. They looked to the relatively strong economic West and the EU. So that's why those Eastern Bloc countries in particular that joined in 2004 look to the EU, and Russia actually sees the EU as a united state, as a threat to Russian power or Russian influence on a world stage.
So it really was an anti-USSR alliance in some ways.
Yes, in some ways, certainly.
And how do we think the collapse of the USSR has affected it?
I think post-Cold War, particularly, you've got... Do you mean the effect on the EU?
Yeah.
In particular? Yeah.
I mean, the effect on the Eastern Europe is very notable. But...
Yes, I think in 2004, that's when you get 10 countries from the Eastern Bloc that includes sort of Poland would be your classic country that you would associate with the EU, and particularly with Britain, because there was a feeling that there were lots of Polish migrants coming to the UK after.
Well, in the 90s, it was lots of Commonwealth immigrants that people were upset about. Lots of, probably not even Commonwealth. Commonwealth was further back than that. That was the 60s. But in the 90s, it was very much anti-Indian and Pakistani.
Yes.
In the 60s, it was anti-black and Irish. Are we just an island of xenophobes?
Maybe 52% xenophobes.
Ooh, bold. It's a bold strategy, Cotton. We'll have to see if it pays off.
Yeah.
So I would argue that there's 52% of people who voted, some in ignorance and some in full knowledge. Some people will enormously benefit from leaving the EU. They're just a distinct minority and do not make up 52% of the population by any means.
Mm-hmm.
I think the argument that 52% of them are xenophobes is maybe a bit strong. I'm sure you didn't mean that,
No, that was
anything more than a glib cheek comment.
Yes.
So if you do listen and you did vote for it, sorry, Dad. I understand you're not necessarily a xenophobe. In my dad's case, he just doesn't like the French. We joined, in 75? Was that a referendum?
Yes, it was.
Okay, so we voted to join.
Yes.
As a nation. Was that a public referendum, or was that simply a parliament vote?
It was a public referendum. So
Okay.
Parliament agreed in 73, and then 2 years later we had a public referendum, much like the one we had in June 2016.
So an interesting statistic is that the referendum won by 67% to 33%. And in a lot of referendums, usually you need a 3/4 majority to pass, due to the fact that a tight margin like 52-48 is so divided down the middle that you are literally going to anger half the population by following through on it. It's not sufficient. I don't think any of us could explain why the government thought it might be a good idea to pass this as a 52-48 referendum and follow through with it. I mean, what do we think the thought process was there, Tom?
I feel like there wasn't one. I think a lot of the thought process was, there's no way we're going to vote to leave. Let's not, I don't think anyone really put enough thought into it when they were going ahead.
Do you think Boris Johnson and Michael Gove wanted the campaign to win, or do you think they wanted it to lose so that they could get the angry people who lost to side with them?
I think there was a lot of manoeuvring, going for political capital within the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party are inherently right-wing, but there is a very right-wing side of the party, and a lot of those kind of voters had left to UKIP. Yeah, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg, the MP for the 17th century.
He's MP for my constituency, where I live.
Oh, where is that?
Bath and North East Somerset.
Is it in fact a time bubble visited by Doctor Who on a semi-frequent basis?
I can't say. I mean, we go out and light the gas lamps like any normal community would do, and I take my horse and carriage to work. So I think no, we're just a regular.
Did your coattails ever get dusty?
Occasionally, but I get the servant over for that, and he helps out.
So on that note, though, who can actually picture Jacob Rees-Mogg as a particularly disturbing Doctor Who / the Master? Jacob Rees-Mogg might actually be fantastic casting for the Master.
Yes, I could see that.
Especially with this young, female Doctor. Perhaps Jacob Rees-Mogg and his archaic principles would be the perfect foe. It's like, what are you doing? You should be in the kitchen, Doctor. I'm a doctor, not a chef.
He's got the round specs and the sort of physique of like a daddy longlegs as well. I think he's all very quite. He could be semi-alien as well. I would be.
Yeah, he is. He's my number one fan casting for Slender Man. I'll be honest.
Yeah.
It would explain where he got 8 children from, wouldn't it? So we joined in 75 through a referendum, and that's the EEC at the time. The UK economy in the 70s is worse way than it is now, let's be honest. That is when a lot of the troubles regarding the unions started. Regardless of your stance, left or right, I think it is a general consensus that the unions did gain too much power in the period. I'd say it's also a general consensus that the government in the 80s pushed back too hard the other way, and the correct balance in the middle was completely overlooked by both sides. 1985, the Schengen Agreement. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, it sounds very German. I wish Mark were here. Speaking of, we do apologise for not having any non-British European friends on this podcast. We did attempt to, but they rejected by virtue of the sheer anger at the subject. It was voiced that perhaps they would not necessarily be able to conduct themselves in an appropriate fashion.
Not that we're going to either.
Well, you know what? I'm on gin number 3. This is...
I need my whiskey.
Lubrication, I think. So if the language slips as we go on, I apologise to Simon in particular. I did take note of your comment. I've been really trying to rein it in, my friend. Perhaps you'll join us for another board gaming episode, but you never left us in the first place. So, the Schengen Agreement. What is the Schengen Agreement?
It was an agreement between the nations at the time who were members of the European to allow freedom of movement, and it made a lot of sense. Particularly if imagine you've got a factory on the German-French border, and you don't want to try and sort out work visas or travel plans for your workers. You just want them to move freely between the border each day.
I mean, it's got freedom in it. It sounds great. It's like the Patriot Act. You would vote against freedom.
Exactly. It's freedom of movement is essentially, and that's one of the core principles of like the EU. It's one of the core tenets.
And we're bound by that, are we?
So we signed.
I mean, we're an island. We technically don't necessarily need the same degree of freedom of movement unless someone's very good at swimming.
It will exactly.
Like David Walliams.
Is David Walliams good at swimming?
He swam the English Channel.
That's quite impressive. I would not have expected that from David Walliams.
Yes,
Shout out to David Walliams.
I think that's all right. Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. That it made a lot of sense for those within Europe, but for the UK and Ireland who signed it, but basically had an opt-out clause. For us, it seemed sort of less of it didn't solve the same problems as it would have solved on the continent, so we agreed to it. But yeah, it didn't.
So we agreed. We weren't forced into this. We agreed to this, and there was no coercion. There was no consequence to not doing so.
No, there was no coercion, and there was no consequence of not doing so. But it was a decision that was taken by our government rather than at a referendum or given to the people.
Okay, and I understand another major decision was made a year later in 1986.
Mm-hmm. So that was the Single European Act, which essentially before that time, because it had been a trade bloc, what was happening to ensure the trade deals and put everything through was ministers from Britain were meeting with ministers from France and Germany, and they were deciding, and then they were going back to their respective parliaments and saying, we've signed the deal. In 1986, they say, no, we need a parliament. We need to have more accountability to the people. So that's why we had European elections to elect MEPs to that parliament who would make those decisions.
So is this perhaps the beginning of bureaucratic bloat?
So,
we already had people making these decisions. Do we really need to insert extra people to make the same decisions that were already being made?
The argument for would be accountability. So you would...
Are these people not already accountable for the decisions they make?
Well, yes, you could argue that by voting them into power to control UK decisions, we are allowing them to make decisions on our behalf overseas for Europe.
Okay.
But Europe said that, no, we should be able to vote separately for what we want within Europe as a whole. That's why we would send MEPs off to a different parliament so they can be the experts on the European matter, and we know who to blame or who to reward if a European treaty is signed or if trade goes well. Then they're the people.
Okay. And I believe at the time, in the kind of zeitgeist at the time, Sir Humphrey had some thoughts on that we'll link in the show notes.
At the time, were we electing people like Nigel Farage to this role?
Not quite yet. Nigel comes a little bit later, and UKIP. We still voted from the established political parties at the time. So Labour, Conservative would probably be the most likely. I could have to look up when Nigel started, but I believe it was early to late 90s when UKIP started to pop up.
So in the late 90s, along comes Nigel, and he has some very distinct opinions on it. So next major events, we've got there's the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and then there's a massive cascading effect in Eastern Europe. Is there perhaps an argument to be made, and this is a statement from ignorance, but is there perhaps an argument to be made that at this juncture, the EU begins to lose its raison d'etre? Like, does it lose its reason for being?
I think it's certainly starting to move a long way away from the original thing that it was, from the original idea of being purely an economic community to something bigger. The ideals that it comes along with is where you can discuss if you support those ideals. So do you like the idea of freedom of movement? Do you like the idea of more accountability? Do you like the idea of all these states having the same currency and being economically strong? I mean, I think they're good ideals to have, but certainly if you'd signed up for it, as the UK had done in 1973, thinking it was merely a trade agreement, that's where you can start to see things sort of spiraling out.
I see. We've got the fall of the Berlin Wall. We have David Hasselhoff singing his heart out. We have Germans rejoicing. And we have an EU that is changed significantly from the original conception of the idea. So, post-Cold War, we've got Eastern European countries with weak economies seeking to join the EU. Is that correct?
Pretty much, at least that's where they're looking to.
Because there is a clear benefit for these countries to join a strong economic community.
Yes, certainly.
And what are the requirements for joining the EU? I believe they are quite strict and stringent. I believe they may have been overlooked on occasion, but I believe you do have to prove an economy at a certain level, you have to prove governance at a certain level, certain human rights requirements in order to join the EU. Is that correct?
That's 100% accurate. I mean, in the Brexit debate, they were talking about Turkey joining, and even though Turkey would have a strong enough economy in this sense, they didn't meet the human rights requirements to join the European Union. So there's an economic and, like you said, political kind of requirements to join.
Okay, Tom, utilising your third-degree black belt in Google Foo, can you inform us what some of these requirements might be?
The Copenhagen Criteria are the rules that define whether a country is eligible to join
When were
the
these
European
established?
Union. These were established in so EU membership criteria. It's not that simple, as with most things, to do with large joining of countries. So, Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, then the Declaration of the European Council in Copenhagen in 1993, and then there were also frameworks for negotiations with an individual state. So. It was agreed in 1993, but there was no actual mechanism for ensuring a country that was already an EU member was already in compliance. So, I mean, I suppose if you're already in, you get off scot-free. That's fair enough. That's how most clubs work.
Because
right?
at this point, we're the big boys club,
yeah. Yeah. And then, however,
we might have still had a navy.
Yeah. Sanctions are imposed against Austria in 2000 by the other 14 member states.
Woo!
And they came into effect in 2003 under the Treaty of Nice. Not nice, Nice.
Are they Nice biscuits?
No, they're nice biscuits.
Are they nice biscuits from Nice? Are they nice?
I don't believe so. I think that's a very English thing, and I think most French people would be like, huh?
You are. I need to know.
Do the French have nice biscuits? That is an interesting Google term to go for.
That's another podcast in itself, I think.
Yeah.
A nice / Nice. Pronounced... Okay, where's the pronunciation? Come on. Have you ever tried to make Wikipedia pronounce things?
Yes. And sometimes it's really
Where's
good.
the button?
Normally on the right-hand side.
Right side.
Next to a recording. There'll be like a little play button.
Media, nice biscuit. Nope, those are just pictures of biscuits.
God damn.
I apologise for this derailing, but I must know.
I mean, at least we can try to pronounce this unlike Jollibokflog.
Jollibokflog.
Jollibokflog. We spent too long trying to do that. I think I did that.
Like a book.
I think Brexit means biscuits, doesn't it? So it's.
Well, I know for certain breakfast means breakfast.
Okay.
A very key point of any camp.
Well, the first Google result from Cosmo magazine. The perfect pairing with a nice hot cuppa is a nice dunkable biscuit. Speaking of which, we're pretty sure you've enjoyed stacks of actual nice biscuits over the years. But get this, they're not actually pronounced nice. Nope, they're pronounced Nice.
But where's the evidence for this? They just say that's it.
Yeah, mate, I don't know. The name probably derives from the city of Nice in south of France.
Wow, okay, so I was...
That's Wikipedia, which is the source of sources.
Not your nephew's sister.
The Daily Mail is pronouncing it Nice. I doubt they'd pronounce anything the French way if they could get away with it. Hey, this is a huge debate. There's a lot of people talking about this.
There are a lot of debates about biscuits, it turns out. At least I'd like to think everyone here can agree, right, that a scone is not a biscuit.
It's not a biscuit.
It's more of a cake, isn't it?
So Americans call what we would call scones biscuits.
Well, I suppose there's actually an easy way to determine that. Does a scone go hard when it goes stale, or does it go soft?
We'll debate.
No, Tom.
Whether it's scone or scone for days.
Does it go hard or soft?
It goes hard, of course. Like
Okay.
all cakes.
Then it's a cake.
Yeah, as we know from the important VAT tax decision for Jaffa cakes, sorry. Not against Jaffa cakes. They tried to go against Jaffa cakes, but Jaffa cakes are cakes, and they made a giant cake. One of my favourite stories. Anyway, we've got a bit derailed there.
So,
would you like to go back to the Copenhagen Criteria?
How did we start talking about Nice biscuits?
Because we talked about the Treaty of Nice, not the Treaty of Nice biscuits.
Yeah.
And I was wrong, 100%
There's an entire
wrong.
treaty about biscuits.
Yep, that's what went down.
Wow. That's mind blowing. It's the most British thing ever, isn't it? A treaty of biscuits.
Right, there's a variety of criteria, and they're in categories. So, firstly, geographic criteria, which is Article 49 of the Treaty on the European Union for people following along at home, or otherwise known as the Maastricht Treaty. It basically states that any European country that respects the principle of the EU may apply to join. So, there's a link to European country on the Wikipedia page, which I'm going to click, which I assume is going to say a country in Europe. Oh, no, it took me to the political geography, and that's a lot more complex. But there is a list, which I'm going to link in the show notes.
Mate, I'm not going to lie. Political geography was not a subject in school. We mostly learned about rocks and precipitation.
That's fair enough. But
geography was not the most useful class.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, that's only lists of states and territories. It's not actually a list of countries. Wikipedia has not made the editorial decision to define that Vatican City is not a country. Although I think most people would agree.
Wait, is the Vatican City not a country? I thought it was the smallest country in the world. Have I been misled my entire life?
I mean, it's a state. It's an individual state. Does it count as a country?
What's the difference between a state and a country?
So that's going to be a hard argument, a hard discussion, not an argument.
Right, then you can shut up. Rob can tell me.
Go to the US. You have states there.
Okay.
Texas is a state. The America is a country.
And I mean, Texas is essentially a country in and of itself. It's enormous. It has decision-making power. So is a state simply like a sub-country?
To be fair, on the Vatican City page of Wikipedia, not to be confused with the Holy See, people, Vatican City, or the state of Vatican City, is a country located within the city of Rome. So I was probably wrong there as well.
So the definition of a state is a nation or territory considered as an organised political community under one government. But that doesn't seem right, because the states in the US are not under one government; they're under two governments, under the state government and the federal.
But they're not considered a nation state. You wouldn't. So, like, there's an unsaid word there. I feel nation state when you say state.
So, whereas a country is a nation with its own government occupying a particular territory. Yeah. Which means now I need to Google the definition of nation. A large body of people united by common descent, history, culture, or language inhabiting a particular state or territory. Texans could be considered a nation under that definition.
I mean, they sure have tried, right?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Another diversion. I think we might have
it's an interesting diversion, though.
It's
related. Yeah. It's slightly more on topic than biscuits, let's be honest.
So I've just read this, and I think this helps with the difference between country and state. It's about sovereignty, which was another part of the Brexit argument. So a country,
God bless the Queen.
So a country has sovereignty, which means that it has power over its own territory, and that no other country can claim power over the territory.
Okay, and a state does not necessarily.
Yeah, it would be subject to other rules and regulations. That's why you could argue that the UK within the European Union was not entirely sovereign, because some of the power over its laws was dictated to by the EU.
Right. Okay, so there is an argument that we lost some of our sovereignty.
Correct.
And that means, to an extent, we were becoming a federalised state, simply with more autonomy than most federalised states.
Yeah, I think you can certainly make the argument that, and the Leave campaign's argument, if you think about the slow take back control, that's what sovereignty is a big part of that take back control.
There is potentially a huge argument there. I mean, I have a very bright best friend who literally, we had endless discussions on the subject. And he insisted, he says, if you cannot see the sovereignty argument, there is not much point in arguing further. That is the defining point for him, is that all decisions regarding British governance should be made by a British Parliament elected by British people, and at no point should any decision regarding British governance be taken out of those hands. And I would say there is an argument there. There are arguments for and against it.
Yeah,
we can explore them at huge length. It is a shame.
We're 40 minutes in.
It's a shame we don't have someone on the opposing side of the argument. I would say that we all voted Remain.
Yes.
It is a shame that we don't have someone from the other side of the equation on this call, let's be honest. As much as it might turn into an argument instead of a discussion, we should be exploring both sides.
I was going to make a point of this later, probably when we got to our thoughts, that, we're not the BBC, so we have no requirement to be an unbiased production. But it would have been nice to talk to someone, assuming they were someone who wouldn't just shout at us, and then vice versa.
We have
But
no
I don't
requirement to be
know-
an unbiased production, but I would endeavour to do so. I would like to.
No,
explore
yeah, I
the
agree.
views.
I agree. But I don't personally know anyone I would consider a close enough friend that I could get them on the podcast to discuss that at the moment. I know a few people I've chatted to about it, but
My best friend was on the other side of this equation. And it sparked some very terse conversations. I got quite angry at some of the things that he would be quite dismissive. Some things like I said important, but different things matter to different people.
Yeah, my father was on the pro-Brexit side of the argument. So
was my father.
Yeah. So first of all,
my father's an international businessman, so God knows why.
Yeah. But part of why I feel kind of a little qualified to have this discussion is lots of hours spent at the cricket, kind of watching the cricket and debating Brexit both before and after. Kind of
None of those European countries play cricket. We don't need anything to do with them. We'll just trade with Pakistan and the South Indies. What's the South Indies? West Indies.
Yeah. But no, like my xenophobic comment said in jest earlier, like we weren't. I wasn't having that type of conversation with my dad. I was having quite productive these sort of sovereignty arguments, those ones, and that's when you get to the core of the argument. It doesn't become a
Give him a call. Get him on the podcast.
Yeah.
Dad, what are you up to? Download Discord. Jump on. Shout out to Discord. Yeah. Thank you for enabling these communications.
Yep, they're excellent service. Free advert for you there, Discord, in the middle of our podcast.
Please sponsor us.
I think what Rob has touched on here is an important thing, similar to a lot of political stuff that's been happening where people seem very polarised. If you get to talk to a real person about these things, I've not met anyone who's been like, go away, France. Like, someone may have that opinion, but I have not met anyone who was of that opinion. Everyone I've spoken to had specific reasons relating to themselves that or their life or their family that made them choose to vote the way they did.
So, no, jokes aside, my father legitimately will not buy any French produce because they will not buy British-produced beef.
I mean, to be fair, our beef was full of mad cow disease. Yeah.
100% seriousness, he will not buy any French produce because they boycott some of our products.
I'll just send him Dijon mustard for Christmas.
Does he drink wine?
Mostly whiskey.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, only from Kent. Let's briefly run through this criteria, and I hope... I feel like, well, I don't know.
Wow, I sidetracked us for a long time.
Yeah, it's fine. Don't worry. It's fine. It's very easy to get sidetracked when you come down to, like, the terminology, because that's an important thing that gets discussed.
Oh, yeah, I'm a complete
during these debates.
I
know it's not just... I don't mean any one of us being pedantic. I mean... People,
it's important that when you use words, you understand what they mean, because otherwise you could be arguing the exact same point as someone, but feel like you're on opposite sides. I've had this with many people where we've actually been on the same side of an argument, but due to a different understanding of terminology, we've been arguing when we're actually on the same side.
As we were discussing, you have to be a European country, which is not defined in the Wikipedia article. They just linked to that link that I'm going to put in the show notes. As an example of when something was not considered an EU country, in 1987, Morocco applied to join the European Community, which is the precursor to the EU, and they were rejected on the grounds Morocco is not a European country.
Is that because it's on the continent of Africa?
Well, I mean, that's fair.
like it could be rejected on the grounds that it's not in Europe, full stop.
Yeah, I mean, that would stop you.
It would be like Yemen or, Mongolia. Like China. China's got a great economy. Do we really? Is it valid for the European Union?
I mean, we did have Hong Kong for a while, and that was kind of like that. But yes,
that was just
and
Britain,
that was silly.
Really,
yes,
Hong Kong was just Britain, just a little island of Britain off the coast of China.
One of my old colleagues at my old job went there and was in a big long queue, and they came up to him, being obviously the only white man in the queue, and they were like, "Are you British?" And he's like, "Yes." And he's like, "Oh, straight to the front of the queue, sir." This is in 2016.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
There's still this weird. It's when you see things like that, you go, "Yeah, empire, not a great idea."
So,
was it?
like, if we were particularly jingoistic, could we just move there and live like kings?
I mean, you still need to be earning money somehow, but you do. I get the impression that people are.
I don't know. What's the exchange rate like? Probably worse than it was.
Probably.
So we've established that you must be a European country. and that other countries outside of Europe have attempted to join and failed in the past. That perhaps Hong Kong was considered because it was a British territory and Britain was a European country.
Northern African nations, there is a policy called the European Neighbourhood policy that allows them to discuss. So it doesn't seem like they're making arbitrary decisions for each country. It's kind of like a blank. I haven't read this. I'm just assuming it's like a blanket. You're not actually in Europe, are you? And fair enough. It's the European Union.
Yeah, you could be like, oh, it's the European Neighbourhood Watch, and we're like, what's it for? Oh, it's just to negotiate how we talk to Northern African nations. Like, so we're setting up a European Neighbourhood Watch because there's Africans. It's a bit racist. I assume it's nothing like that. Rob, please correct me.
No, I'm sure it's nothing like that. I am furiously clicking on Wikipedia.
Yes, it's a foreign relations instrument, oh my, of the EU, which seeks to tie those countries to the east and south of the European territory of the EU to the Union.
If it's anything like past negotiation instruments for Europeans dealing with African nations, it's a big stick.
Yes, I think it's a bit nicer. But it covers a lot of northern African countries and countries to the east, kind of ex-USSR. Doesn't apply to things like France's territories in South America because they're too far away. The EU offers financial assistance to countries within the European neighbourhood so long as they meet strict conditions of government reform, economic reform, and other issues surrounding positive transformation.
Define positive transformation.
It doesn't.
Not necessarily you. I mean, someone needs to define that, don't they?
I mean, yeah, I assume there's a big long bit somewhere in this foreign relations instrument.
I'm sure, Führer Trump's idea of positive transformation is somewhat different to our idea of positive transformation. Good job he's not in the European Union.
Yeah, I think positive transformation would be the extension of Western liberal ideas, so freedom of democracy, that type of stuff, freedom of speech, those elements to try and make them more Western liberal in their outlook.
That's a really interesting assumption, considering all of the attempts to stifle and censor that have occurred in Western Europe in the recent years, and how the massive shift to the right regarding immigration policies and freedom of movement has moved. Like the idea that we have these liberal left-wing Western ideas of freedom, I think are sometimes not matching up to the modern reality. So we've got the neighbourhood policy to regard. So basically, we attempt to economically influence the decision-making of northern African countries. This seems like a proactive method to try and spread values that we approve of without being militaristic about it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think if you're going to change people's minds, free transfer of ideas is a better way of doing it.
Money.
Well,
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, they're saying, you have to do this or you do. There is an element to
adopt some of our values, and perhaps your society will get a bit of influx of cash. It's just bribery, really, but I don't think I'm opposed to it.
Yeah.
It's happened before in history. After World War II, you've got the Marshall Plan to the whole of Western Europe, because Western Europe was decimated economically after World War II. So the US came along and said, well, instead of being tempted by any communist tendencies you might have and thinking that's the solution to your
Red's
problems,
under the bed.
Yeah, exactly. Why don't we give you some money? Convince you that the American capitalist way is the better way, sort of a culture victory on Civ 5. That's the victory that they're going for.
You're a whole Civ behind the times, right?
Oh, sorry, Civ 6 now, isn't it? Sorry, apologies.
Aye. I believe culture victory in Civ 5 and the 6 is determined by tourism, so I think you're thinking of Civ 4 mechanics. So you need to catch up on your gaming. You've been spending far too much time looking after your wife and treating her to gin and engaging in political discussions with reasonably educated people. Get back onto the games, bro.
I agree. I will stop wasting my time on such frivolous subjects as that.
So
I think I'm going to try and run through the political criteria.
Yeah, let's run through them without me interrupting you each time.
Yeah, so democracy. You have to be a democracy to join the EU. Seems reasonable. There are some specific parts there. It's not just you have to be a democracy. It's things like requiring free elections with a secret ballot. And so there's a set of tick boxes to say we consider you a proper democracy as far as we're concerned.
I'm going to interrupt. I promised I wouldn't, but I am. We don't have to sidetrack completely. I'll make a brief comment on each point. So I wonder if democracy entails direct democracy, representative democracy. I wonder what the criteria for democracy is. We don't have to look it up now, but
it says in the Copenhagen Criteria Wikipedia page, functional democratic governance requires that all citizens of the country should be able to participate on an equal basis in the political decision making at every single governing level, from local municipalities up to the highest national level.
So even prisoners, or even worse.
I mean, as we know, EU lets that in. So So
Well,
yeah,
they
one would
require
argue.
it, apparently, and we don't.
But that's what I'm saying. Like in general, the EU policy
We're in
yes,
the big boys
prisoners.
club.
So
Next one.
rule of law it implies that the government authority may only be exercised in accordance with documented laws. So you don't have any like secret police going around and beating people up and stuff like that. A safeguard again. It says it's a safeguard against arbitrary rulings in individual cases. So you have to follow the law of your own country. So that's fair. Then there's the next section is human rights. So you have to agree to basically agree to uphold the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as we've already touched on. That's actually enforced via the European Convention.
European Union?
No, it says the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is considered the most authoritative declaration of human rights, but the European Convention on Human Rights is the effective enforcement mechanism they use.
Yeah. My question though is Italy a member of the European Union? I believe it is.
Yes.
And does it follow the European Guidelines of Human Rights when it comes to gypsy populations?
I have literally no knowledge on that subject.
So I'm just going to Google this before I say it. I don't want to say anything that's not true, but I did come across something a number of years ago. And if it's not true, we'll just cut this little tangent out. But I hope, okay, I can't find it this quickly. I hope I'm not true. I want to be corrected. I read something recently, well, a number of years ago, not recently, about an Italian bill that I believe passed, but it is really fuzzy. It might never have happened, about tagging Romani populations.
Wow, okay. That's not okay.
No.
I think we'd all agree.
Literally tagging them so that you could identify and track them and like.
So, given that we've just talked about that, the next point is respect for and protection of minorities. Members of such national minorities should be able to maintain their distinctive culture and practices, including their language, as far as not contrary to the human rights of other people and democratic procedures and rule of law. So, as long as you're following all of that. And the Council of Europe has a thing called the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, and it lists a load of countries in there. Notably, it does not list Italy, so I have no idea. It doesn't list us either. I would argue we don't have a massive minority population. You see what I mean? Like we have had people come in as immigrants, but we haven't got we have Scotland, Ireland, and Wales are all big countries in and of themselves. So it's not like we have a particular minority population within England that I can think of.
No, I think you're right, Wilco. And there's no kind of if you're looking back to the atrocities of the Bosnian War and stuff like that, you had
that's mentioned
places that were targeted, weren't they, by government policies, and Britain has nothing like that, and I certainly no member of the EU now has anything like that.
I mean, we are predominantly a white society. Let's be honest.
Yeah,
Britain.
Yeah, and especially outside of cities, it's most very strong white population.
Absolutely. I mean, we do have a surprisingly large immigrant population, but a lot of this, I think, that people don't understand is that our immigrant population was so high because in times of economic distress, we relied on first Commonwealth and then Indian, Pakistani, and then Polish immigrants to take on work that people weren't doing. We actively encouraged this immigration, and people got angry when these people came over, but they were an economic necessity at the time.
Certainly, it's Windrush. If you look up the ship Windrush, that was the one that came over from the West Indies and those islands, and they were the ones that brought them in after the Second World War, when we were in desperate need of labour in the country. And again, I think the Pakistan, and I hope I get this right. I think under Idi Amin, he was expelling all the Pakistani migrants from Uganda at the time, I believe, and the British government accepted them in, and that was in the 1970s, 80s. So there's always been kind of the British government has invited people in, but for some reason the British populace has sort of shaken its fist angrily.
So as of the 2001 census, Britain was 92% white. And as of the 2011 census, and bear in mind this is self-identification, it was 87% white. So that number did fall 5% in 10 years. So, not that I agree with white nationalists. I think they can all go f*** themselves with a rusty razor. That's my first swearing of the podcast. I think it's justified. The numbers, I can see why people who care about something so petty and irrelevant would be alarmed at the numbers. I just don't see why they care.
Yeah.
We are currently 7% Asian or Asian British. What's the difference? It's an ethnicity, isn't it? If I'm concerned, you live here for enough time, you're British. Black and black British, 3%. British mixed, 2%. Other, I wonder what other consists of. Maybe Pacific Islands?
Yeah, I imagine it's just there's probably a statistical threshold they cut things off at for the purposes.
Isn't it
of putting on the
fantastic that
graph.
Wikipedia lists this as white, Asian or Asian British, black or other? like, are you white, Asian, black, mixed or other? Oh, grim. I guess we have 0 Native Americans. Or like, what's an Inuit come under other?
I imagine that's probably what it is. Like,
Yeah.
There is actually a very interesting Wikipedia article we can put in the show notes about how the census has changed over time.
And it seems like a tangent, but it is actually really important to the Brexit discussion because immigration was such a huge part of the campaign. Take back our borders. Like, people say it was not about race and it was not about immigration. That is willful ignorance. You can't ignore the part that immigration and race had to play in this vote. It is impossible unless you are intentionally blind to it.
I think part of the thing there is there have been studies on this that I'll have to find to link in the show notes, but having certain views on race, people understand that is not okay in polite society, but may still hold those beliefs for whatever reason. And there is a psychological thing where people won't come out about that. So
yes,
that doesn't. I'm not saying 52% of the country are racist. It's just that there are people who will have voted because of that, or that will have been involved in their decision, even if they weren't conscious of it. And then when you ask them about it, they won't say that that's why they did it. So that's where I think where a lot of the arguments saying, "Oh, it definitely wasn't about race," comes from, because no one person is. The majority of people, when you talk to them, are not saying that's why they voted for it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people who will simply cite overpopulation as a reason. It doesn't matter where these people are coming from. We just need to stop it. It doesn't matter what colour they are. It doesn't matter what country they're from. We just need to get a handle on our exponential population growth because it's unsustainable. And there is an argument there. There is a global argument there, not just the British argument.
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument there's an argument
from the environment to food production. That in every single metric, exponential human growth is an absolute problem for the planet. But immigration does not cause exponential growth for the planet, just for the area we're in. But then it can put strain on public services, on the NHS, on police and fire brigade services, simply because there is more area to cover, and not necessarily as many roles to fill at the time. Particularly in a tertiary industry society, where we are a service-dominated society, not a production-dominated society.
And this was put under a microscope for Brexit, and underneath, we've already talked about freedom of movement. Freedom of movement was something that allowed anybody who could get into Europe then had a path to visit any country within Europe without necessarily those countries having controls over who came in. So in 2015, you had the migrant crisis, which was very well documented, where you've got refugees from Syria, from Libya, and you've also got economic migrants from Turkey who are coming out, who are trying to find refuge in one European country. And the worry there from some members of the EU was that it only took them to get into one European country for them to have the license or the right, as the EU would say, to freedom of movement, to then move.
Can we understand that concern?
I think I can certainly, from a Leave point of view, understand the concern that the government, the UK government, had no means to actually go to the EU and stop any of that migration from happening. They had to accept freedom of movement in order to be part of the European Union. The EU wasn't moving on that fact. So if you wanted some control over immigration for people,
regardless of whether we think that immigration is a problem or not, it's the matter of whether we get to decide on it ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, precisely.
And that is an argument I can sympathise with, if not necessarily some people's reasoning to reach that conclusion.
Yeah, I would be of the opinion that the refugees coming from Syria and Libya deserve our help, and why not? Would be my opinion.
And being realistic about immigration, we would have been and continue to be a very prime indication, or a very prime target for relocation. We, at the time, had the 5th strongest economy in the world. We'll reach why we're not the 5th strongest in the world at some point in this discussion, but there is only one country in the EU that had a more powerful economy than the British, and that was the German economy. So you can see why people would see it as a desirable place to aim to be. We have we have a welfare system As much as it can be improved in areas, it's a wonderful thing that we have it, that we look after people in this way. It's a matter of trying to. We can just. I can completely see why someone would target us as a place to be. We're a land of milk and honey to people who don't have any. And from our perspective, it doesn't seem like that. We're all struggling to buy a house. Some people are struggling to not die. Like, put that into perspective. Would someone want to move here when their biggest worry would be, can they get a job in order to increase their luxuries? Or, are they going to starve? Like, why would you not want to be in the country where your biggest worry is your amount of luxury and your degree of luxury?
Briefly on that point as well, another point that was made to me by an old colleague was that it's indicative of how effective we have been, essentially how effective the British Empire was as a propaganda machine. Despite the fact we went around taking over people's countries for hundreds of years, most countries that we've been in go, oh, we quite like the Brits, they're nice, and so they think of Britain as this place that is, as you say, like land of milk and honey, this amazing place they could go to. So if they are then suddenly left without home and kicked out of their country for whatever reason, well, where have they heard of that's great? Britain. Everyone who ever came over there from Britain said Britain's great, so they decided to go here. Which, some people could see that as an advertising gone wrong if you're against immigration. Sorry. So yeah, it's there's two more points. One is economic criteria, which is basically you have to have a working market economy, and they have to feel you're strong enough to join the EU and not just be destroyed. So they have the European exchange rate mechanism we mentioned earlier and some other stuff for joining the Eurozone that ensures they can try and get you involved before you actually join. And the final thing, which is apparently technically not in the Copenhagen Criteria, but it's legislative alignment, which is all prospective members must enact legislation to bring their laws into line with the body of EU law. This is kind of, I think we're going to probably touch on this more later, and we have already with kind of the idea of sovereignty and what of our laws are EU laws, what of them are British laws, how do they interact? And that's that. Page done.
So 1999, we had the next big shift in politics for Europe. There were minor shifts in between. I don't know when Russia decided to annex Georgia, but 1999 there was the euro. The euro was a huge proposal, like a common adopted currency for the eurozone. Ooh, is this another step on the road to federalisation?
That's what a lot of countries thought at the time, or at least in particular the UK.
I think perhaps at this point it's no secret that perhaps some people do have dreams or ambitions of a united European states. It might not be a majority, but I think the concept exists.
Yes,
exactly.
So the euro, pros and cons of joining the euro for the UK.
It's the pro. I think it's more general. It's the pros and cons of joining any monetary union is that you share the highs and lows, and it kind of you don't have an exchange rate anymore. So for the poorer countries, they might suddenly find things are more expensive. For the richer countries, they may find that their profits are kind of heading towards the cheaper countries. It kind of
would they be more expensive for poorer countries, or would they simply be paid like? Because, I mean, just because you've got one currency doesn't mean that the product is worth the same no matter where you go.
No, that's true. That's true.
Like, I don't understand why us charging €1 for a loaf of bread in the UK might mean they had to charge €1 for a loaf of bread in, south of Greece. Like, surely they could charge whatever they wanted.
Yes, it doesn't mean the prices are the same and flatten out. But I believe I couldn't tell you the name of the economic principle, but I believe there is a tendency for things to start to equalise if you go into a joint currency arrangement like that. Don't quote me on that. I'll look it up and see if I can find something to put in the show notes. But I believe that is the case.
It's the general idea, and the fact would be that the stronger country's economy would back up the weaker country's economy. So if we want to take ones on extremes end of the spectrum, so Germany and Greece, Germany would be helping to prop up the Greek economy somewhat if they both join the euro. The downside of it is when things go wrong. So the Greek economy, in particular, after 2009, really tanked. If Greece was entirely in control of its own currency and the value of that currency, what Greece would do is devalue that currency, would make itself incredibly cheap, which means the exchange rate for buying something in Greece, it would attract outside investment, and hopefully
And you can't do that with the euro, can you?
No, the Greeks are tied to the price of the euro, so they've actually got to that they can't attract that outside investment into Greece. So that's very much a downside of the
But
euro.
can they not simply provide services and goods for less euros? Would that not still attract investment? This is the part I struggle to understand about this, because I do kind of get the concept, but I don't understand why you can't simply do the exact same thing without devaluing the currency. You can simply provide the service for less money.
I don't have the answer. I would be the same. I don't know.
Because that's the basic idea of capitalism. Like, whether you agree or disagree with it, the basic concept of capitalism is competition. And if someone's providing a service of the same quality for a lesser price, you instinctively go there.
I think I don't know whether there are protections in place within how the Eurozone works that would make that harder to do. But I think the idea there is that, say I don't know what kind of percentages we're talking here. If you lower the value of your currency to attract inside investment, I don't know if we're talking a few percent or we're talking 10%. But imagine someone said to you, take a 10% cut in your pay for the service you're providing. I imagine for a lot of people that'd be very difficult. And I think
that'll go jobless. I'd have to.
Well, yeah, if it's that or to go jobless, but I think in the moment, what decisions do people make? They don't necessarily know in 6 months' time that would make them go jobless necessarily. And these things don't happen immediately necessarily. They're often happening over a long period of time. And I think there's a part of that is there. But again, I am not an economist. I'm just trying to remember what I've heard from occasional bits of economic podcasts.
I think from what I remember, apologies if repeating myself here, is that if Greece starts to try and devalue the euro by making things cheaper, it has the knock-on effect that the euro then becomes worth less for Germany and France, who are very big economies, who would get very upset about that happening. So it's more in France and Germany's interest, the strong economies, to keep that economy, to keep the currency strong, and Greece has less power in that situation.
And speaking of Greece, is there not a lot of controversy over Greece being allowed to join the European Union in the first place? What year did Greece join the European Union?
I'll have to look that.
Google's furiously. Greece, if you type in Greece, the next thing... Greece joined the EU in 1981, according to...
1981, okay. And is there not a lot of controversy, however you want to pronounce that word, about the joining of Greece to the European Union? Was there not some reported fudging of figures regarding their economy and the minimum requirements they needed to meet that they did not, but they were allowed to join anyway?
I'm not sure, but I'm sure I heard that somewhere, and that was...
I've heard it repeatedly, but we need to substantiate it at some point.
If we're talking before 1980, I think that goes before the Copenhagen Agreement, which would put in very strict measures, and it's certainly before Maastricht, which would have put in the European exchange rate mechanism, which would force currencies or force members of the EU to have a stronger currency. So there's certainly an extent to being this would be a weaker country that got into the EEC before they started to get more strict with what their entry criteria were.
Right. So we don't join the euro because we decide that the pound is too powerful to give up, which, let's face it, at the time was the right decision. The pound was the most valuable... It wasn't the most valuable currency in the world. Places like Oman had some ridiculously valuable currencies, but it was a significantly powerful currency. I do think it's a common misconception that the pound was the most powerful currency in the world, though. I think it is perhaps one of the most widely valued and the most widely traded, but individually, it was not the most valuable currency.
I don't think I ever heard the argument that we were the most powerful, but I definitely heard a lot of people talking about how we were a very strong economy.
Yeah. I think it's just a misconception that a lot of people who don't consider Middle Eastern oil-rich countries in the equation, they've never heard of the currencies or countries in the first place.
Yeah. And it's very easy to conflate that we have a strong economy. Like if you hear a mate say, "Oh, we have the best economy," and you've heard that we have a very strong economy, it's easy enough to go, "Well, that seems reasonable because I've already heard the first thing."
Yeah. So, there's the Treaty of Nice in 2001, which we've previously discussed regarding biscuits, regarding criminal laws and common foreign policy. 2004, 10 more countries joined. Which countries joined in 2004?
Well, I'm pretty certain that's when Poland joined, but I couldn't tell you the rest off the top of my head.
That would probably line up roughly with the increased influx of Polish immigrants to the UK.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that was the whole discussion.
Which is where UK racism switched from colour of your skin to country of origin.
So, according to the 2004 enlargement of the European Union page on Wikipedia, the simultaneous accessions concern the following countries: Cyprus, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Malta, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia.
Malta, that's a small country.
Yeah, it is. And 7 of those were former Soviet states.
So that was basically a giant finger to Putin. I assume Putin was in charge then. I don't remember Putin ever not being in charge in my lifetime of Russia.
Yeah.
Either he was in charge or he was, in charge behind the scenes and poisoning people. If I'm not on the next podcast, you know why.
Putin has been the president of Russia since May 2000.
Yeah, so that was a giant fuck you to Russia, really, wasn't it?
Yes, and I think a proclaiming for the Eastern Bloc that they were looking at the European Union way of doing things rather than the Russian way of doing things.
Which was met in, 2014, 2015 with tanks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, didn't work out too well for Ukraine, although Ukraine didn't join us, did they? Maybe they should have. Maybe they wouldn't have. Maybe Putin wouldn't have done that if they joined the EU. Maybe he wouldn't have wanted to challenge that kind of
Probably. Probably.
The Ukraine conflict was because Ukraine had just the prime minister had just been elected, had formally been supportive of Russian control and influence, and then they were about to switch to EU influence, and they were quite a long way down the chain with the EU to try and look at a path to joining. Then the civil war and other things break out, essentially.
TLDR,
civil war as well. Yeah. God, that was a mess, wasn't it? So 2009, Treaty of Lisbon.
Yes, so this is where we've got 3 elements: justice, government, and security. They were all formerly controlled separately. Now they all come into one big body, the EU as we know it today. And as we've been talking through this podcast and the history of it, we've shown how when Britain joined, it was just about the economy, and slowly but surely, more powers, it's got a greater remit of powers that have been coming under the umbrella. The Treaty of Lisbon is the way to formally put all of those powers into one organisation, the EU.
Okay, but any country in the EU had a veto on major decisions like this, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And in some countries like Ireland and Holland, I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but Ireland, they went to a referendum. They went to a referendum of people and asked them if they wanted to approve the Lisbon Treaty or not. In first instance in Ireland, it was rejected, so the Treaty of Lisbon had to be rewritten so the Irish people would approve of it.
That's the way it works, isn't it? Any one country can veto an entire decision.
Yes.
Or not? Is it any one country, or is it any one of the original countries?
Any one country, I believe, that you need to have unanimous agreement on the European Council to put certainly a treaty of this magnitude, because it affects all 25 at the time in the same way.
What are the odds that we could just get so detached in the European Union as MEPs that we go full Star Wars Senate on the job? And you don't actually need the vote of the people of this nation, you need the vote of its representatives, and those representatives are not infallible. What are the odds that an organisation like this, that is so centralised in such a bubble, is it not prime grounds for corruption?
Well, that was the accusation that was brought about at the time, and there was also a huge scandal in the early 90s, Treaty of Rome, where it had uncovered huge levels of corruption with European officials in the early 90s. So the reputation of the EU had already been damaged by a scandal of this level before.
Because I would be concerned with that, honestly. Understanding that's the way it works, is that you have a relatively small number of people deciding things for everyone else, and they could very much form their own little society. There's very little in place to stop that happening.
Yes, I mean, you've got... They would argue that the EU Parliament...
And then you get separatists, and then you get the fall of the Jedi, and the rise of the Empire, and, then we're all in for it.
But they would argue that the MEP voted for by the people is the control on that. That because they've widened the franchise, that now every citizen of the European Union can have their say on how it's governed through the MEPs that they elect, that would reduce corruption rather than it being unelected civil servants.
And then the British people began to elect MEPs whose policy was to not attend meetings and not vote on anything.
Correct.
So we actively chose to give these people more control and more power over us, and to not participate in discussions or have any input. as a society.
Yes, and even when you're looking at turnout figures for MEP elections, they are in the 20s and 30s. Nothing like.
And that's out of how many MEPs do we have in the UK, or did we have?
Did we have? That's a Googleable question right there. We have 73 MEPs.
73, and you're saying that a lot of the turnout in votes was around 20 to 30 of them.
It was 20 to 30% of the entire electorate who could vote. 20 to 30%
because
of people
just didn't care. People
out.
didn't understand it. People didn't know how important it was. People didn't know how important it would be, and people just the people who did seem to care were the people who were actively invested in not being in it.
Yes.
So apathy, really, was the real sealer for that for the UK. So 2009, we also have the European banking crisis. End of 2008, beginning 2009. Some countries arrest people, some countries don't. We could do a whole podcast on what happens in this period. Labour are going to be out very shortly, and the Conservatives are going to be in because they're riding high on the Labour Party's inability to predict and deal with this economic catastrophe.
Yeah. I think it's just worth mentioning, not for our British listeners who will remember how it went down, or our European listeners, but just in case we have Americans listening, that obviously the banking crisis hit them in 2007, and we did very well for a good year and a half, I think. I mean, I remember going to Canada in the summer of 2008, and the pound was worth twice the dollar, and the Canadian and US dollars were the same. So the buying power we had at that period of time was great. But obviously, eventually, because it was a worldwide economy, it caught up with us. And that's when why all this kind of started to happen in 2009.
And at this point, we've talked about the growth of economic power throughout the EU. A lot of people could sort of point at the EU as being responsible, or at least the people who needed to sort out the economic crisis that was happening around them. They'd centralised all this economic power. Now it was their job to try and get us out of it, and how they handled that crisis would probably reflect on how people would view the European Union in years to come.
Okay, so there's a massive economic crisis, which honestly probably doesn't affect public opinion of the EU as much as a lot of other events. A lot of the blame is centred at the Labour Party in the UK, rather than at Europe, and at central banks and inefficient reins and controls on them. There's relative quiet, other than a couple of international conflicts, until 2015 when the migrant crisis hits the headlines, and that is people so desperate to get to the UK that they're drowning on rafts, that there are camps set up on the borders of France. And these people aren't happy to settle in France, they aren't happy to settle in Germany. They seem intent on the UK. I mean, why do we think that is? Why the UK? Why not Germany? Why not France? What is fundamentally different, if not in the country or the governance, but in the perception of it? Do you think perhaps the sheer prevalence of the empire in history, and the fact that people, maybe just the power of the brand that's persevered long past perhaps its due?
Yeah, I think, I touched on it a bit earlier, and I remember having this discussion with a colleague at the time driving back to the Eurotunnel. And yeah, I think that's a big part of it, that the grass is always greener, right? But people have heard about Britain all over the world in a way, and not to say people haven't heard of France either, but yeah, we've been going around stamping our brand on places for so long, or at least leaving things behind that people know we exist to some extent.
So my girlfriend's grandfather, emigrated to Britain in the 50s from Ireland. And when you ask him why he chose to move to Britain, his response is generally to get my money back. Do we think that perhaps plays into a bit of it?
Yeah, probably. Well, obviously it does in his case, so, he probably isn't on his own.
So migrant crisis ties into fears of what? Global terrorism. Any one of these people could be a terrorist. Could be is enough of a justification for many people to take no risk.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got the rise of ISIS time as well. That's the reason why people are leaving Libya and Syria.
Oh, yeah. We've not touched on ISIS yet, have we? So,
No.
What's causing the migrant crisis? ISIS. What's ISIS, Rob? Other than an Egyptian god?
It's the Islamic State organization, which is an independent caliphate run by some pretty nasty people. who essentially tried to control the area between. They took advantage of the civil war in Syria, the political crisis that happened after the removal of Gaddafi in Libya, as well as the insecure political government in Iraq. And they build up a pretty nasty.
Why would the Iraqi government be insecure, Rob?
You're setting up so many potential podcasts in the future. No, the Iraq War and the general destabilization region by the UK.
Sorry, I can't hear you over the sound of bombs. You'll have to speak clearly.
Sorry. There's a lot of reasons for the destabilization of Iraq, but they feed into that, and it drives a lot of people out who see Europe, who see the journey across the Mediterranean as the way out to a better life, one where they're not being threatened by either their own government in the case of Syria or the Islamic State, as well in Syria, but they had so many different pressures on them within these nations that Europe seemed like the obvious haven.
Okay, so yeah, there is a migrant crisis. There is also an international crisis in terms of ISIS. ISIS are taking ground. They're taking countries. They're declaring themselves the next caliphate. And for those people who don't know, the caliphate was an old Islamic empire spreading across most of the Middle East and North Africa and even southern Europe, including countries like Spain. So the caliphate was massive, and ISIS are declaring it is their official intent to reinstate the caliphate and reintegrate all of these countries by force. So people are scared of terrorists at this point. This is a whole new level. This isn't 9/11. Some people did something horrific. There is now an army declaring itself the genesis of an empire, sweeping across the Middle East and forcing people to join, which is what was happening. And it's died down a lot in the media right now, but the problems are still there. And Cameron wins the election. He wins a re-election on this point. At this point, it's not a joint coalition. It's a completely conservative government, and he wins it because one of his promises is that there will be an EU referendum, because there is a schism in his party about whether we should be staying or going. We've got a leader in the Labour Party for this. Jeremy Corbyn was not leader of the Labour Party, but this is Ed Miliband and his bacon sandwich. And it's sad that that's what we remembered for. But Cameron wins
and
this
that big
election.
stone. Do you remember when he put his promises on a stone?
The
What a
Ed
great
stone.
idea that was.
I do not. What like the Ten Commandments kind of thing?
Literally, yes. It was
No,
ridiculous.
whose PR stunt was that? No.
It was his idea. It was an organised effort to see how many times he could shoot himself in the foot. It was just.
I hope he was just like surrounded by bacon sandwiches as he did it.
No, it's
like bathing in bacon juice.
You don't get many opportunities to sort of write your own gravestone, but Ed Miliband in that moment did.
He signed it and everything.
And signed himself. And,
I bet he didn't sign that. He's not that handy with a chisel, is he? Look at that man. He's never held a chisel in his life. So, the Conservative Party wins, and one of their promises is this EU referendum. It's important to touch on at this point, we've already had was the Scottish referendum, what year was that?
The year before, right?
Okay,
Yes.
It was before that election because
2014 we had a Scottish referendum. One of the key points of the Remain side was that without remaining in the UK, Scotland can't remain in the EU. Because if Scotland leaves the UK and tries to join the EU, Spain will veto it on the grounds that
Catalonia might do the same.
that Catalonia will try to leave Spain and will also join it. So Spain will not allow Scotland to join because it sets precedent. So this is reinforced, and people in Scotland are worried about the economic ramifications of leaving the EU if they leave the UK, because that's one of the things that the Remainers say is, we don't need the UK, we've got the EU, the exit side, sorry.
Am I allowed to do a deep dive on the 2015 election very quickly? Just to kind of...
Only if you do the entire thing in a Scottish accent.
I can try my best, but I'll see what I can do. No, I can't.
No, stop that immediately. Stop.
We'll get letters. I don't want letters.
Not angry letters from Scotsmen.
Angry
They spell
claimants.
things weirdly. Use words like Ken instead of no. Or think they're talking about Barbie dolls. It'll all be terribly confusing.
So
proceed.
That's okay. My quick deep dive is 2014 UKIP wins the European Parliament election, they become the biggest party with the most MEPs, and that sends the main political parties, Conservative, Labour, and Lib Dem, into kind of like panic mode. They're not quite sure what to do. There's a real risk that UKIP will be a threat at the next election. So Cameron's a year away. They know it's got to be a year.
I even have words for that.
Yeah. So Cameron, worried that the UKIP vote could split the Conservative vote and lead to a Labour government coming into power, says, I will promise we'll have a referendum, we'll finally end this European question.
And there's no worry at this point that there might be a UKIP government. There's just a worry that UKIP will take enough votes away from them that they will lose.
Yes, exactly. Because of the way our first past the post system works, the Conservatives are very worried that if they lose too many, if UKIP gain 10 or 15 seats, that will be enough for there to be a coalition of chaos, as they put it, with Ed Miliband and the SNP, who are winning in Scotland, and that would force that if Labour were in power with the SNP, that the SNP would use their power to force another referendum on the Scottish issue. So this sort of big...
Because they wouldn't possibly try to do that if there was, a vote to leave the European Union.
Precisely. So with all these fears, Cameron wins. All the polls before that election were suggesting it's going to be a hung parliament. Cameron
And these are all the polls that immigrated after 2004, right?
After 2004, sorry? Sorry, the election poll. Very slow on the uptake. The election polls, the opinion polls, that suggested that it would be a hung parliament, and that would be a problem there. So Cameron wins, but the other big factor is that UKIP, despite only getting one seat in Parliament, win, and I'm trying to get the figure now, the percentage of the vote they win is 12.6%. So roughly an eighth of the population, just over an eighth of the population, still voted for the UK Independence Party. They become officially the third biggest party by number of votes cast for.
And if you want to take a real deep dive into this, check out episode 1 of The Hat of Many Things. We spent a number of hours discussing the exact demographics, figures, and statistics surrounding the most recent election and how it was related to some of the previous elections.
Self-plug, always good. It was a good episode. I like that episode.
So 2015, after 2015 election, the scene is set for, we know that there's going to be a referendum on the EU, and also we know for certain that an eighth of the population feels so strongly about this that they've decided to vote UKIP, despite the Conservative Party promising them a vote on
just on the basis that this is what UKIP want.
Yeah.
UKIP have almost no other policies of note. So that's a brief rundown of that election. And why it played out some of the ways it did. And what's important to note here is that the Conservatives were predicted a hung parliament and won with a startling majority.
Yes.
It wasn't close. The Lib Dems got completely wiped out due to mismanagement of their public relations, I'd say, more than some of their individual decision-making. They got absolutely decimated. We now have a Conservative government that has to follow through on its promise or look ridiculous. We have a schism in the Conservative Party where half the party legitimately want to leave, and we have the people leading this party who, to my impressions, never wanted to win. They were playing politics at its worst. They did not appear to want to win the vote to leave the European Union. They wanted to lose it closely so that they could take power of the Conservative Party off the back of a dissatisfied populace.
And have political capital for the years to come, essentially.
Yes. And they win. They win the European exit vote. I come down in the morning, my girlfriend's crying. I
was up all night for that. My God,
she's been European her whole life, as far as she's concerned. She's a firm believer in these creating these bonds between societies and breaking down barriers. And we voted to leave and to attempt to isolate ourselves more. And shortly after, the ringleaders of Vote Leave are suspiciously absent. The people who should now be riding high on an influx of support and power hang their heads, slink away, and they hide. Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Boris Johnson drops out of the leadership race for the Conservative Party. This is a man who now has a very good chance of winning on the back of his recent quote-unquote success, and he chooses to back off. This indicates to me that he never intended to win this vote. He never wanted to leave the European Union. He just wanted the support of people who did.
Well, he He dropped out of the leadership election because his friend Michael Gove, who said that he definitely wouldn't run, decided to run for election hours before Boris was about to announce his campaign. And on the back of that, he felt that the Leave vote within the Conservative Party was going to be split too much, so decided not to run.
Did he?
Well, well, I think if Michael Gove hadn't decided to run, then Boris would have made it to the last two of that.
So Michael Gove is the Peter Pettigrew of British politics, man.
he is.
Like,
He is totally
You're infinitely like the snivelling brat who would hang out with them when they were at school and at Eton, and would be at the back of the dinner queue trying to hang out, but would be the butt of everyone's jokes. I've actually been assured this isn't the case. Apparently that was George Osborne's role, because George Osborne was new money, don't you know? Apparently Michael Gove was known for his wit, but he just strikes me as someone who got bullied at school. And that's coming from someone who got bullied at school. Like, he strikes me as someone that was never popular. So Michael Gove runs. He's not eminently successful, is he?
No. I know we touched on it a bit in the election episode, but I think it was probably clear. I mean, it was a bit crazy, but it became clear quite quickly, because both Boris and he kind of dropped quite quickly, and then it became quite clear that we were probably going to get Theresa May, like out of the running.
And Theresa May was the non-positional, wasn't she? She was kind of the moderate middle ground candidate.
Yeah,
that
and that
no one
obviously helped.
really expected would win at the start, because she wasn't such a strong personality as the other candidates.
Yeah, but I mean, out of, was it 4 or 5, they got down to Boris?
Yeah, they dropped really quickly. It was nothing like the Labour.
It was like a week, wasn't it? The whole
the
thing?
Labour leadership election took forever, and then had to have a revote and try it again because they weren't happy with the result, and tried to ignore a democratic result on the bill, and the Tories were just sort of they consolidated very quickly. They decided who their leader was, and they got behind them 100% for the most part. That is, as much as I'm not a Conservative supporter, I think that is an admirable trait in a party.
It's a thing that the Conservative Party has been good at doing, that kind of stuff, keeping the party together. And I mean, that's all these decisions around Brexit seem to be mostly related to that.
The way the Conservative Party elects their leader is that they vote internally first, so they knock out their candidates quickly because they're just voting between the MPs within the party.
Which is what Labour used to do, but they tried to take it back to a democratic decision and then didn't like the democratic result.
Labour used to do it, so Labour, you have to have been nominated by MPs to be somebody who can be voted on by the trade unions, members of the Labour Party, and MPs.
Yeah, and as a result, we somehow ended up with Comrade Corbyn on the bill, and he was a 1,000 to 1 outside chance at one point.
Yes,
he's the boy's still never lost an election.
Yeah, apart from the general election, you could argue.
Yeah, but I think long term that might have been the best thing for the Labour Party.
Oh. Certainly, we haven't.
I said this in the build-up to that election. I said, ultimately, short-term, I think a Labour election would be good for the country, but I think long-term it would actually be bad right now, because Brexit would happen. The Conservatives already triggered the article. The Labour, are going to struggle to undo it. Labour would have to manage it. It is ultimately, in my opinion, going to be a disaster. Labour would be stuck with the blame for it, and the Conservatives would be riding high on power for another 8 to 12 years. Especially with recent events, Grenfell, Carillion, there's huge economic blows, blows to the Conservatives' credibility, their power, and Labour would have been hit with all of those reputational hits within the first 2 years of governance, and it would have destroyed their credibility for a long time.
And people would have said, "Oh, it's just the same thing that happened during the banking crisis."
Yeah,
they've tied them all together, even though they're not necessarily related things.
I think ultimately, being cynical, the best thing that Labour could have done in that campaign was campaign to lose by a narrow margin. I think winning would have been a disaster for them.
Yes, I think much like we were just saying with Boris Johnson Brexit, the best thing for Boris was that
he loses narrow.
He loses by 1 vote, and then he can spend his time on the outside complaining about the result. And
not 1 vote, enough votes to not warrant another referendum.
Yeah,
enough of a difference to not warrant another vote, but close enough of a difference that people are still angry and upset.
Something like 52 to 48%.
I think something like 64.
There was a nice meme that went out the day after the Brexit result came out, and it was of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove glumly looking at the floor, and I think the quote was something like, "No, you take back control. No, you take it. No, you take it." Like as you said, that all the Brexit figures kind of just disappeared from the public sphere as it became apparent that they'd actually have to go and enact the thing. It's bore out, I think, the past 2-3 years.
So we've got a referendum result. We've got a split populace. We have a reported increase in racial-based attacks and abuse. A lot of people appear to feel justified in some xenophobic views that are not, and I repeat, not shared by the majority of Leave voters. But a minority of people who have these strong views suddenly feel validated in those views. They think that 52% of people agree with those views because they agree with something else that leads to the same conclusion. And they get more vocal. And we get more EDL marches, and we get more BNP marches. And then we get counter marches. And at this point, things get very hairy. We potentially face a second Scottish referendum because, quite frankly, why would they not want a second referendum? The entire major case for staying has now been thrown out the window. There are other cases for staying, but that was one of the major points of the Remain campaign, and it's been taken away. And we are left with Brexit. And what does Brexit mean? As Wade rightfully pointed out earlier, Brexit means Brexit. Have you ever heard an emptier soundbite?
It's useless, and I think Nick. There's a very good quote by Nick Clegg, which I can't remember, but Nick Clegg said something along exactly the same lines as you said.
Oh, Mystic Clegg.
Yeah, yes. There's an
Mystic
article.
Clegg who correctly predicted every single step of it 2 years in advance.
Yes. I feel sorry for poor Nick Clegg. He's just been a man who's been...
He's just been knighted. Don't feel too sorry.
Well, he was... Did you see his face after he lost in 2017? It was one of the...
And he accepted it with humility. Fair play to him.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the person who beat him got thrown out the party for posting sexist things on Facebook years ago.
Yes, I think maybe... maybe Cleggy can feel a bit validated. Thing, really. But yeah, he's certainly... Nick Clegg's book on Brexit is very good if you get a chance to read it. I would recommend it to everybody if you're looking for I think it's called a plan to stop Brexit or something on those lines.
No, we are not sponsored by Nick Clegg or his book or publisher. No. Wait, hold on. You work for a publisher. Did your company publish this book?
No, not in any way.
Okay, we are not affiliated with these organisations.
If they want to give me money personally, but for you guys.
So what's that quote, Tom? That particularly choice quote you pulled out?
Yeah, so I googled Nick Clegg, Brexit means Brexit. I'm not sure this is exactly the one you're talking about, but he said it's a bit like staring at a building site and saying we've made progress because we've made a cup of tea.
And Brexit negotiations, how have they been going?
Well, I feel like we keep turning up and not really negotiating anything.
But we want unicorns, Tom.
We believe in the existence of unicorns and will do everything to get them, but sadly, they don't actually exist.
So, are we making demands that are not possible? What demands have we even been making? What do we want out of this? Does anyone know? The communication has been so poor. We want a hard Brexit, we want a soft Brexit. That doesn't mean anything.
Well, an over-easy Brexit.
What are the things that we're trying to achieve?
The problem here is that people voted for Brexit with no other qualification. The vote was, do you want Brexit, yes or no? Not what level of Brexit do you want? And also, it wasn't even technically a binding referendum. It was an advisory referendum. So one would have thought that 52 to 48% would not be enough for people to be like, yeah, let's go with it.
Yeah, God knows why we proceeded with it. Jesus.
But it's very much no one really knows. So because it's a political thing, everyone who's going there to debate and discuss and argue our case with the EU doesn't want to put themselves in the position where they're pissing off any of their constituents. But not all of their constituents voted for Brexit for the same thing. So they're trying to offer everything. They're basically saying, we will get everything we want. And
we want our cake and eat it.
Saying no. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and a lot of those things are like saying, oh, well, we're not going to pay you to the EU, but that's kind of not how that works. If we want
I think someone needs to identify the fact that the only way you can still have a cake post-consumption is through vomiting it back up, or it coming out the other end. And either way, once that cake has entered and exited either of those orifices, it's no longer cake. And we certainly don't want to taste it.
That is a brilliant metaphor. Yes.
You don't hear that on Newsnight, do you? So it's very.
I should work for Private Eye. I'm sure I could get myself sued. Is that a prerequisite for working at Private Eye?
I think
No, but it definitely tends to happen once you're there.
How many cases of libel do you have to successfully have defended and or lost? So we've established why the vote happened, and the vote didn't happen because of the EU or because of whether we should be leaving or stopping. It happened because the Conservative Party in power got scared of losing power in the UK. It was nothing about, from a political level, why people voted. People voted to leave because it was important to them and it mattered to them. Whether they were informed or not, there is a mixed bag. Let's not try and put numbers on that. We honestly can't tell you. But the vote only happened because people in the Conservative Party were scared that Labour were going to catch up to them in British polls and that they were going to lose their position as the dominant British party. This was not about EU or international relationships. This was about British internal politics, and it went horribly wrong for everyone involved except Nigel Farage.
Well, yes, you could argue things have gone a bit south for Nigel since.
Well, yeah, I suppose he's not got a job anymore, has he?
No, UKIP as a party are redundant. They achieved what they set out to achieve, and now they're nowhere. Your first podcast was on the 2017 election. I think if you go back to that one and look at the percentage share of vote that they got compared to 2017.
Interesting, it was evenly split amongst Labour and Conservatives.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
We assumed that the majority of it was Conservative votes, but there's a lot of Labour heartland up in the north where communities had been decimated by, first off, Thatcherite economic policies, and then secondly, an influx of immigration to the area when there was already a decreased economic strength, and it all snowballed, and Labour lost votes in this area to people who wanted an easy out, to people who wanted someone to blame.
Mm.
So, we've had the UK election, we've got Maybot in charge, strong and stable, strong and stable, strong and stable.
That sign falling apart behind her.
One of the weakest leadership figures I've seen in my life.
It's interesting because, I think a lot of people thought she was, I'm pretty certain we said we didn't think she was going to last in our
she's a
first
mouthpiece,
podcast.
Isn't she?
And I think the thing is that she's, that no one wants to touch the Prime Ministership right now.
It's currently
because
appointed into Chalice.
Yeah, exactly. So they're just leaving her there. And everyone's like, why is she still here?
She's a terrible leadership figure.
Not
She
great.
is there because nobody with an ounce of sense wants to be the person in charge of a negotiation that cannot, in any possible scenario, end well for them. The legacy of whoever negotiates the exit of the European Union will be a legacy of failure. Now, whether somebody can create a legacy of success off the back of it, whether somebody can reforge Britain into a stronger economy, into a stronger dominant power, whether they can re-establish us as a global power figure in a way that we haven't been for a long time, remains to be seen. But in the short term, we are shafted. In the long term, we can't predict it. We might get great trade deals with Australia, with Canada, with America, with China. We don't know that yet. But in the short term, the economic impact of leaving the European Union is devastating.
Yes, and the economic, it'd be even worse if we leave without a deal with the EU.
Oh my God. Yeah, describe a no-deal scenario.
No deal with no word of a lie. It's almost apocalyptic in its scale of chaos it would cause within our government system and with our trade deals, everything.
Are we straying into the realms of hyperbole? Hyperbole's fun. We can all engage in hyperbole. Everyone loves a bit of hyperbole.
Yeah, it's okay. So if we say no deal to the European Union, every country in the world has deals. That's how globalization works. That's how our whole system of government works together. You have to have relations with countries. If you don't have diplomatic relations with countries, your only other option is war. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're about to go to
an internalized bubble economy.
Yes, but
which requires you to be self-sustaining, which we are not.
Yes, that's impossible. You need a discourse with the EU, and you need to have those channels open.
What was the last time we were anywhere close to self-sustainability? It was during World War II when the government had to seize control over production of pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Because it was the only way to really organise enough food production to feed the country.
Yes, and I hope we can all agree that we wouldn't be ready for that type of upheaval
No.
within our country.
The only way to become a self-sustainable country is to go full-blown 100% socialist, and that is not going to happen.
Well, not under Theresa May's government, I would assume, anyway.
I still doubt it would happen under Jeremy Corbyn government.
Yeah.
I don't think he could pass it, no matter how much he'd like to.
And I mean, like the state of the world is different. I mean, how many people have their own garden in big cities nowadays and could grow like crops like they had to do during the war? Things like that. That just, it's not easy to just turn on that tap if we suddenly need it.
Yeah. So what don't we get? If we leave the EU with no deal, what do we not get?
We don't get access to one of the biggest markets in the world. So essentially our trading capacity would be diminished.
Because a no deal means we haven't even negotiated new tariffs. And even with a deal, it means we still have access to some of it, but not as a single market. We have to start negotiating individually with countries in order to... Well, not even individually. We have to. They don't negotiate individually. That's not the way the European Union works, is it? They negotiate as a bloc.
Yes.
So any trade tariff that we establish with one of them, we establish with all of them. So our free trade is now going to be hit with tariffs. It costs to import and export everything. So what, do we hit them back with tariffs? Where does that leave us? Into an escalating war of trade tariffs? These are the things that started wars 300 years ago, or even more recent than that.
Yes, it would escalate tension between Europe. Well, one thing that hard Brexiteers have said is that we could go to World Trade Organization rules. So there is there's a standard in place where you just can go back to these rules, and these are the ones that govern for the whole world. But I think the only country in the world that operates on those terms with the EU is Mauritius, which is such a tiny country and just incomparable with what we do that it would be almost unthinkable that we would fall back to that level of trade with the EU.
So economically, we're a net importer, is that correct? We're not a net exporter.
Correct, yeah.
So any tariff that we impose is going to have less effect than any tariff that is imposed upon us. That is simply a statement of fact. And we cannot dictate the tariff that's imposed upon us. We can only dictate the tariff we impose on the people. So if we try to hit back with tariffs, we have less clout. Anybody who believes that we have more economic clout than the entire EU trading bloc is delusional, because we have less economic clout than Germany.
Yeah.
Yes. It's very simple.
Yeah, I mean, what the thing that we have is we're very good at services, but being very good at services is not going to help when we don't have access to manufacturing that we're currently
without
importing.
primary and secondary economies to fund and provide the goods for which we require services. There is no requirement for services. We regress into a secondary economy.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if California suddenly wasn't part of the US.
Yes,
It'd
it's
have
a very
less
good
wine.
analogy.
Yeah.
So, you know, the consequences of leaving from a negotiation point of view, from a human rights point of view, from a trade point of view, are enormous. And there absolutely must be a competent negotiator leading a competent negotiating team trying to establish a deal that works for us and them. Because that's what negotiation is. If we go in swinging our big British around, it's going to get bitten off.
You have a way with metaphors, Mike. Sorry, Rob.
I was just going to say that's probably like the difference between. Have you heard of hard and soft Brexit?
Hey, that ties aptly into my metaphor.
Yeah, yes, precisely. If we want a good deal, we need to approach with a soft Brexit, probably, or that's what we're going to have to settle for if we want to still keep the benefits of.
A hard Brexit is the attempt to strong arm the European Union using our own power, and a soft Brexit is the please don't shaft us as hard as you can. We will concede some areas in order to gain some benefits.
Exactly. Yeah, and with the deal I think you mentioned earlier, if any progress had been made, we've made one bit of conceivable progress within our deals.
David Davis did something?
Yeah, so November, I think it was.
Are you sure it wasn't an imposter? Have they actually have they actually killed him, hired some random guy, and got him to wear David Davis as a meat suit so that we can make progress?
Just a spitting image puppet of him.
Just a lizard, man.
So on December the 8th, we reached an agreement on our divorce settlement. So this is the EU and the UK agreeing that we can finally make a path to leaving each other, which you think would have been solved quite a lot earlier than that, with our Brexit decision. But it took until December of last year before the two parties agreed that, yes, now we can divorce and we have some terms for divorce. And part of that deal was that we will have to pay the EU between 35 and 39 billion pounds.
How many 350 millions fit into that? How long is it going to take us to get that money back for the NHS? That's what I want to know.
Well,
it was written on a bus, Rob. It was written on a bus.
All political discourse should take place by writing things. I mean, obviously.
I would love to see just like, we promise a brighter future. Fuck you, you're a and then they're just like, there's no need for that kind of discourse. Are you kidding? My wife lost her job. I would love to see just some guy buying bus adverts. And these buses just going past each other and just an escalating war of words written on the side of buses. That's the kind of political discourse I want to see in the 21st century.
Almost like the great Brexit battle of the Thames.
The flotillas.
The most ridiculous thing that was.
I don't think I know what you're referring to.
Bob Geldof in a boat shouting at Brexiteers.
What is it like? It was always going to be Bob Geldof, wasn't it? What's Bono had to say on the matter? I'm sure Bono's had an opinion.
Yeah, but he didn't take his boat to attack Nigel Farage's boat on the Thames.
This is just like
peak Britain.
This is just rich people in a nutshell, isn't it? Like, rich people on either side of the spectrum can just do absurd things for publicity. Look how much fun Nigel's having waving at them all, man. Nigel just wants attention. He doesn't care whether we're in or out. He just wants to be in front of a camera. He just wants people to care about his opinion. He wants to be relevant. And that's why I swear he's been on the BBC News more since we've done it, and he's not even in charge of Party anymore. He's no longer relevant to the discussion. You just linked two links to the same story from different Wings newspapers.
I mean, you can very, very much see the difference in the...
Welcome to unbiased media. Yeah. So, where's it been? How did we get here? Where's it going? These are all very complex discussions. We touched lightly on all of it. It's getting late. I've had 4 glasses of gin, and we need to start talking about what our next topic will be. So, Tom, what are you going to draw from the umbrella hat? I want you to wear that when you go scouting, by the way. It'll help keep you
I'll the explorers will be like, why are you wearing this? And I'll be like,
keep me
because
dry,
of the
obviously.
podcast. And they'll be like, well, at least they'll understand what podcast is.
You know what? You need to get like a hat of many things sticker and then make sure that it's firmly on there. And Rob and any listeners, if you have suggestions for further topics, be they political or otherwise, please do let us know. We have a Facebook, we have a Reddit, and you can let us know on the Hat of Many Things website, which Tom will provide the domain name for shortly because I have had 4 glasses of gin.
It's hatofmanythings.com, which will take you to...
I should have known that.
Yes. So we have drawn from the hat as our main topic video games.
Video? Yes! Something I know something about. Do we have subcategories for that?
We do have subcategories. I don't know if we've done an introduction, but we did a special on the Switch. So I don't think we've listed a video game introduction on here. So we could just do a video game
an introduction to video games. That's the most pointless podcast ever, and I'm sure people know what video games are.
I mean, I think people listening to our podcast probably do.
Yeah, we can talk about video games. There's a lot to talk about. Conveniently, the League of Legends European EU LCS begins tomorrow as of recording on the 19th of Friday, so I'm very much looking forward to getting back into watching my favourite esports teams.
I've just drawn our subcategory.
Is it esports?
It is esports, which is on there. But esports, that's the thing I don't know much about, so I will find that very interesting. Maybe I should try and practice my hosting skills so that you two can talk about it at more length. We'll see. I'm not going to add living, as we've already discussed. So,
excellent. So next week, next episode on the How Many Things, we will be discussing esports. Are they sports? Really? Questions. Next time on Hat of Many Things. Thanks, Rob. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.
No problem.
And
That's a clap, not a fap.
Hey, I'll take both. You know, I'm not fussy.
You can see your images of Rob out of Many Things site, where he will be providing a host of. No, you don't have to provide a picture, but if you want to strike a couple poses, maybe show a little bit of belly button. Who knows?
I do many things for art. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for your time, gentlemen. Thank you to anyone who did listen. Please do give us your opinions. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree? Do you wish we'd said something we didn't? Do you wish we hadn't said something we did? We do want to hear from you. We really do. I'm just repeating myself. Kind of like Theresa May.
Strong and stable.
Can I just say a big thank you for letting me do one of my dreams, which is just talk to people about politics. There's so many people who you talk to and their eyes sort of glaze over and start rolling into the back of their heads whenever you start mentioning Brexit. So anybody who's been interested by this, or anybody who likes to listen to this stuff, I'm thankful that people like you exist, and I'm more than happy to just talk with you at length about Brexit.
Still going to be less popular than our episode on board games.
Of course.
Is there anything of yours you'd like to kind of sell on the podcast?
Do you have anything you want to promote?
Yeah, exactly.
No, the magazine I produce is specifically for secondary schools, so for teachers every second half term. So that's not something I can promote like that. But if I ever come round to it, maybe in the future, it's something I'd really like to do and spread my wings so I can do more of my own opinion stuff rather than having to keep it nice and secondary school friendly.
And in a loosely connected issue, I would direct people to the Twitter feed for Liam McLaughlin, a good friend of mine who's a PhD researcher, doing a lot of research into social media and how it affects politics, particularly surrounding the abuse of MPs and politicians. So I would recommend having a look at his Twitter, which is at Liam. That is Lima Echo Echo Lima University Mike. What's a U in the phonetic alphabet? Unicorn? Fox? U-boat? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's Liam, at Liam on Twitter. Liam has a lot of interesting things to say about social media in politics. If we can add that to our list, Tom, I'll be very happy to talk about it. He recently was on the radio version of Question Time, so he definitely knows what he's talking about.
And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And hopefully we will all leave you, our listeners, on better terms than we leave the European Union.
There's a Wade. And
oh
he's
my
muted.
God, we have our first audience member.
Yay!
Recorded in front of a live studio audience. Cheers is brought to you by Tom's Alcohol Drinking.
Recorded in front of a live Wade.
Let's Wade.
The great thing is, imagining Wade laughing at us saying stuff.
Nothing for Let's Wade right in.
Right, so if everyone hits record nowish.
Yeah, I already did.
I figured you probably had. Cool.
Oh, I already did.
Mike will normally count us in, but it doesn't matter who does.
In. Yeah. Clap.
Mark.
Mark.
You got it there. It's fine, Rob. Got him.
Fantastic. 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 Fantastic.